have a question before Nathan begins asking his questions. Um, you the idea of Jesus Christ, who is that to you from all the knowledge that you've gained over the years? Who is that to you now?
Well, I am torn between two different hypotheses. One, that there was no historical Jesus, and that is largely because too much of it fits too well the ancient mythic hero archetype. Everything from a divine annunciation to a miraculous conception, a child prodigy story, miracles of healing and exorcism, healing where ordinary doctors cannot, the sort of brand X versus Jesus kind of things. Excuse me. And then great popular acclaim, some kind of acclaim that he is a king or should be, and but then the people turn on him, and he is put to death on a hilltop, oddly enough, in several different ancient stories. And then after that, there's uncertainty about where the body is. There's a few examples of that in the Old Testament, even with Moses and Elijah and so on, but also with ancient Greek stories. And possibly often there are post-mortem appearances to disciples, giving them orders what to do henceforth in his name, and an ascension into heaven. And there's so many such stories. And nobody really thinks any of the other ones are historical. So suddenly here's one in which people have a vested interest because of their institutional affiliation with churches and so on, where, oh yeah, they'll make an exception for this one. And as a comic book fan, I always compare it to, suppose somebody was desperately trying to get people to believe that Superman had actually existed. Okay, we don't see him today, but back in the 30s, he appeared and so on. And you said, well, wait a minute. Why should I think he's any more real than Captain Marvel or the Martian Manhunter or any of these guys? What's the difference? This one really happened? Yeah, that's right. It seems to me once you step back from it, you realize what a row there is to hoe. It just seems like it's special pleading. And not only that, but I think the thing that pushed me over the edge on mythicism, so-called, was that virtually every gospel story can easily be explained. By that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, not that you can prove it, but it is very plausible to suggest that each gospel episode is a rewrite of some Old Testament story, usually involving Moses, Elijah, Elisha, sometimes Joshua, sometimes David. And you begin to wonder, wait a minute, like Jesus multiplies food miraculously for a number of people. What's more likely, that actually happened, or that somebody simply rewrote a well-known scriptural story, which would have been so far in the past, there'd be no real reason to believe that happened. Now, this does not involve some stubborn refusal to believe that miracles or paranormal events happen. Who knows? I mean, unless somebody invents a time machine, we don't know what happened in the past. But what is more likely? What is a story look more like? And another silly example I give, suppose you came in from a hard day's work, something being a shiftless bum I never have to do, but supposedly you came in from a hard day's labor and you sit down in front of the TV. You don't remember what channel was last on. You click on the thing, and the first thing you see is footage of a giant reptile stomping Tokyo into matchsticks. What's your first guess? Oh, I guess I'm watching the news channel. No, you don't know that this is impossible. though you've never heard of a real case of it. But you do know there's plenty of Godzilla movies out there. So what would be your guess? Which is more likely? You'd have to say it would have to be another Toho Studios flick. And that's the way all history is. You don't know what happened. You weren't there. But well, in fact, it's like my father. He was in Patton's Third Army, and he was present at the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. He told me what he had seen. He wrote it down and so forth. So when nuts out there say, oh, there was no Holocaust, I said, no, I'm afraid I know better, because my own father was an eyewitness of it, right? But usually, with something 2,000 years in the past, you don't have that kind of reliable testimony. And I know people try to circumvent that by saying, we weren't there, but the apostles and the gospel writers were. We don't know that. That's sheer supposition. There's no way to prove that, and it's not even clear that it's a claim by those authors, though people read it that way. So I wound up thinking, it seems most likely to me that there was no historical Jesus. There probably was no historical Buddha or Moses, and you can make the same sort of arguments. But the other option that I take seriously as a possibility is the one set forth by scholars, I guess, beginning in the 18th century, like Hermann Samuel Reimarus, and after him, Robert Eisler, and then S.G.F. Brandon in the 20th century, who said that Jesus probably did exist, but he was an anti-Roman insurrectionist, like several we know of from contemporary historians, like Josephus and others, who told us about this one and that one and how they came to a bad end and so forth. There are some really startling similarities there, and also odd little things that look like loose ends in the Gospels, things that don't seem to fit the general narrative, but do kind of sound like somebody has tried to whitewash the thing but missed some stuff. Like at the Last Supper, where Jesus says, up to now you've gotten along fine spreading my message, right? Yeah, that's right, Lord. Well, from now on, if you don't have a sword, you'd better sell your shirt and buy one. And well, here's a couple of swords. Things, well, that ought to do it. What is that? What is going on there?
Right.
And this is right before the arrest in the garden, where these guys do whip out swords, and it's an abortive attempt to rescue him. And what is Barabbas? They say he had killed somebody during the insurrection. What insurrection? Was it the thing that Jesus led at the temple? What did he do in the cleansing of the temple? This area, the court of the Gentiles that he's pictured, overturning the tables and all that stuff, this was bigger than several football fields.
Oh, wow.
He must have had an armed troop in there to control the space, which it says he did, right? He wouldn't let anybody bring the temple vessels back through. What was he doing? Just said, shame, shame, stand back there. No, he must have had armed guards. And there are other things. He had one disciple known as the Zealot, and a little later we hear of the fourth philosophy, the revolutionary zealots, who are violent anti-Romanists. Another one named Bar-Jonah. Well, that was the Bar-Jonim. They were another revolutionary group. Or oh, geez, there's a third one as well. But at any rate, what are these odd things doing in there? And I think, well, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Right.
It looks, or the whole thing with blaming the Jews and getting Romans off the hook. Oh boy, that Pilate, he didn't want to, he would do anything to save Jesus' life, but he lets himself get bullied by a handful of pool hall rallies underneath his balcony. What? They threaten him, and Pilate? who was a notorious Jew hater. It just doesn't square with what we know about him. And so it seems to me either we're dealing with a fiction based on legends, or we have a heavily rewritten thing trying to sanitize someone who had been a revolutionary prophet, and that he got into trouble, was crucified as a rebel, but the group wanted to continue, and they said, just like non-Christian Jews, okay, Rome, we're not going to give you any more trouble. Can you let us just go on as a religious group? Yeah, sure. Like, I don't know. There's nothing implausible about that. So I have to admit that that's a viable way to look at Jesus. But again, who knows? It's just juggling theories, and that's all we can ever do, apparently.
Right.
Wonderfully said, Robert. Wonderfully said. Oh, I want to just mention a little bit about you, how you have 5 PhDs and how you're an author, a successful author, and also how you're a well-renowned scholar across the world. I'm a huge fan personally, and that you can see you all across YouTube. So I want to highly recommend you, obviously. So I want to put that on record.
Right on. I have a question. Well, before I ask this question, Robert, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I started my website about 3 years ago. It's because it's about ancient history, and ancient history is big on religion. Also, my favorite civilization goes back to the Sumerians, only because they're considered the first to have a writing system in the academia world. And I'm sure you've heard about the Anuna / the Anunnaki, right? And I'm pretty sure you have some ideas on who they may be or who they may not be. But when I started to study the Anuna / the Anunnaki, I had to learn from the academia world of who exactly they were, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature from the Oxford University. I also had to read the book that they also have, the Ancient Literature of Sumer. And everything that I read from ancient Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, and then the Mahabharata from the Indus Valley, the Sumerian text, the Akkadian Babylonians, and so on and so forth. In the ancient Egyptians, of course, I get this sense that there's obviously something that individuals believe in that are gods. But I believe that the word God has gotten so far to the point where people believe that there's only one singular God, only because of what they read in whatever holy text that they read. But when you go back to the ancient texts, like the Sumerians, you get this idea of who the Anuna are. And when you read the ancient Hebrew text, you learn about the Elohim. I want to understand from your perspective, from what you've learned, what is the true definition that you think is the most reliable definition for what a God is, or what God is?
Well, that spins off into a lot of different things. I always feel like that the conventional view of God as a non-material being with a personality, with a mind, with a will, and so forth, who is nonetheless somehow ever present and all-knowing and outside of time. I take that sort of popular conventional definition to be the God I want to argue about as to whether it exists or not. And there might be, if it does, there's well, apparently it's a he there, and that's but people seem to realize there's a problem with this, and so they begin to say, oh yeah, I believe in God, but let me totally redefine it. It's the power of creativity, or it's the lure toward the future, or it's the power of being, whatever that means, or and to me, that might be the case, but I don't think you're really talking about what anybody means by God anymore. And like Tillich really pushed this to the limit when he says, it's an incorrect question to ask whether God exists, because to exist means you're a being, you are participating in existence. And yet, as it's nothing new, Thomas Aquinas and others said that God is being itself. God doesn't participate in being. God, if a God would, Zeus would be the supreme being, the greatest of all these divine entities, but he exists, supposedly. Whereas it's not quite clear that if you define God as being itself, or the ground of being, that it even means anything to say God exists. You're dealing with a different order of speech then. Does being exist? Well, there you've dipped into a philosophical debate about what would it be? Nominalism and realism. Is like Plato says, is there being with a capital B that is more real than the things that exist? Or it was Aristotle, right? Well, no, that's handy, but it's a generalization. It's just a conceptual model. That's a toughie. I tend not to go with the idealists or realists, that there is this ideal reality, the form of the good or whatever. What do you mean there is such a thing? Conceptually, it's in your mind, but as what? As like a what do they call them? An irrational number or an imaginary number or something. It doesn't actually exist, but technically it's a logical factor in mathematics. And so is that what you mean by being itself? And so Tillich said, it's not clear that it's even a meaningful question to say, does God exist? God doesn't exist, because he's not. That's to lower the divine.
Wow.
And it is mind twisting. But I do kind of take that seriously. And it seems clear to me that the minute you start getting any use out of God as a person, when you say, I hope God will answer my prayer that evil will subside in the world and people will learn to love one another. What do you mean? What is he going to do? Hypnotize everybody? Or do you say, oh, thank God I didn't get on that. I didn't make my flight because the plane crashed and everybody was killed. Well, I know what you're saying. Thank God. You're saying,
yeah.
That is something to be grateful for, but are you grateful to someone? I don't think so, because that's like when Jesus says, I love this thing in Luke where people tell Jesus about this Roman atrocity that they killed a bunch of Jews while they were sacrificing in the temple. And Jesus has answers. Do you think all those Jews were worse sinners than all the rest of the people in Jerusalem? No. Or those on that, he brings up an example, those on whom the Tower of Siloam crashed. You think they were worse sinners than everybody else in Jerusalem? No. And that's, it's like once you start raising elementary questions, it just seems ridiculous and absurd. What is God? God is a genie of some kind. He needs you to tell him what to do. And he's involved in, he's answering everybody's prayers. It's like Santa climbing down the chimneys of every house all over the world in a single night. It just seems to me it's not a viable notion. You can't really think it out to a degree where it makes any sense. But okay, then I don't believe in a personal God. But then what else do you mean by it? I think that vanishes too. So I don't really want to say I'm an atheist, because that's too narrow. I would rather say that I am not a theist. And I don't even disrespect those who have beliefs, because I mentioned Aquinas. Aquinas he makes me look like some sort of salamander. I mean, there are believing Christians that or much smarter than I'll ever be. I just have to call them like I see them, but I respect everybody else's opinion.
Right.
And so I hate this kind of what I call Westboro atheists, the ones that just hate religion and religious people. That's not what I'm at. I'm kind of a loyal opposition because I love religion and religious people. But I guess I feel like Joseph Campbell. I cannot really identify with any of them anymore because I kind of know too much about them.
Okay.
So that's more than you asked for.
No, I'm glad you said it like that.
That's
because
wonderful.
That is wonderful. It makes sense. You basically gave me your emotional feelings towards it with your knowledge behind it, and that's what I needed, because, like I said, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I kind of I don't believe the same things that I believed in when I was little. And it's only because, like I said, I studied the Sumerian language. I studied Akkadians, Babylonians, the Mesoamericans, and so on and so forth. I really deeply get into it. And when you mentioned Plato, I actually have 30 of his books. Like, I love his books because there's so much knowledge in there. And I really read a lot. Like, it seems like I read so much to the point that one thing, I have one question answered, but then like 10 more questions come up behind it. And it's like that for everything that I read about. I have a lot of articles on my website that I share where I take these, those little signed signature tabs that people put on contracts and stuff like that. In the old school ways, most people, they used to highlight their books or underline those. Well, in order to go back and find that stuff, you have to have the page number and you have to go through the book and find it. I actually just put those signature tabs there now, so that way I can quickly flip to it and be like, okay, I want to research this material more. So I read at least 6 to 8 hours a day, and then I take that when I was a little kid, I never used to read. The first book that I actually read that got me into reading was probably Animorphs. I don't know if you know anything about that, but it's a really good show. They started a show on it. It had a couple of book series on there, and it kind of started me on reading books. I'll tell you a story about it. I actually got grounded one day, and I couldn't watch TV and stuff. My parents wouldn't let me watch TV for about 2 weeks. So I found this book. I don't know how I got the book in my hand, and I just read the book, and I was like, this is pretty interesting. And then you mentioned how you said your father was in the war, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually served. I'm actually a combat wounded veteran. I was wounded in Afghanistan.
Wow, my hat's off to you.
Thank you. And it's an honor to serve, And after I got wounded in combat, they had to let me go because I have a lot of wounds. I have a brain injury, and I took some shrapnel and so on and so forth. So after that, when I got medically retired from the military, I actually started to read more. Like, I started really reading books. So I sit there and play The Simpsons in the background because that's my favorite show. I have that playing in the background, and I'll sit there and read.
I like the cut of your jibs.
I enjoy it. I really
have their tartar sauce.
Yeah. I just watched that episode yesterday. I mean, when I watch The Simpsons, I watch The Simpsons. It's like a ritual here. My wife knows if I'm ready to go to sleep, I'm gonna turn on The Simpsons. If I'm ready to read, I'm gonna turn on The Simpsons and stuff. But I like to do this, and that's how I actually found Nathan, because he's a Gnostic. He loves information. We come do a lot of comparative study discussions online, and he's taught me a lot on the Gnostic side, because I feel like and that there are a lot of people out there that have information, and if we take all our puzzle pieces together and put them, on the table and work together to put that puzzle together, there's no idea what picture we've seen. And the only reason why I say that is because it's hard to get all this information. You can spend hours and hours and hours reading, but it's never enough time to do that. My favorite author, he wrote books in the 1700s, 1733, Godfrey Higgins. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he has these. Yeah, he has these books, Anacalypsis, Volume 1 and 2, the Celtic Druids, and they're really thick books and with a lot of information on there. And it seems like everything that I research in his books, it still kind of applies today. The only issue is that he's only going off of information that he was afforded at that time frame, and as time went on, we did more archaeological digs, more studies in linguistics and so on and so forth. So more information came out, but the information he shared never really went away anywhere. It's like almost an encyclopedia guide for individuals that want to learn about the origins of religion and languages and so on and so forth. But I really appreciate you saying that. Nathan, anything you want to say?
100%. I would like to ask you some questions, Mr. Robert Price, about Paul being Simon Magus, which I 100% agree, and Gnosticism being the main foundation of Christianity. I'd like to see your views on this subject.
Well, I have a sort of complex and admittedly weird sounding theory of Christian origins, in that I do think, well, I think that Christianity began probably as a kind of Essene sect, just like Renan and a lot of people said. And that's partly based on recent work that explains the strange Christian appropriation of Passover as a reinterpretation of the celebration of Pentecost every 50 days with the sacred meal at Qumran and so on and so on. But there's, I think that Robert Eisenman, and before him, another guy, what's his name? Oh boy, I'm going senile. Maybe I'll think of it later. These guys said that the Dead Sea Scrolls community was the Jerusalem church, and which only makes sense of a lot of things that people have said since the discovery of the scrolls in 1947. That, wow, boy, look at these parallels of the early church in Acts, the communalism and this and that and the other thing. The governing body of 12 and an inner circle of 3, which sounds a lot like the Gospels and so forth. And if you combine that with what the pseudo-Clementines say about the sect of John the Baptist, who again has long been hypothetically connected with the Essenes and Qumran, we're not absolutely sure, but it'd be almost surprising if it weren't so, then the pseudo-Clementines tell us that the two top disciples of the teacher of righteousness, who was apparently James the Just, they were Simon Magus and Dositheus, another Samaritan, and that Simon was in line to be John's successor, but he was off in Egypt doing research when John was killed. And so they went to number 2 and made Dositheus the head of it. And Simon was not too pleased when he came back and found this out. Well, for a while, he was a good sport, but he began to become disillusioned with Dositheus and challenged him supposedly to a miracle contest. I don't know what that would have been, but who knows? Dositheus said, I got to admit it, you are the standing one, not me. And then Dositheus supposedly left town and started his own sect, which lasted for some time, the Dosithians. And but then if you put this together with admittedly cryptic cipher language from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says that the spouter of lies was separated from the men of the community because he renounced the covenant in the midst of the congregation, and that had something to do with his building a city of blood, recruiting the simple ones of Ephraim, promoting smooth things. He was making it easier, like what Bonhoeffer would have called cheap grace. And this sounds to me so much like the split between Paul and the Jerusalem pillars, and what Judaizing Christians didn't like about Paul is, wait a minute, you're telling these poor dumb Gentiles they don't have to be circumcised and keep the Torah? I mean, we're talking about the Jewish Messiah, and you're saying we're not going to keep the Jewish Torah? What is this? You're just making it easy for these people. They're not really even true followers of Jesus, though you're deceiving them into thinking they are. But this tension, Paul says in Galatians that he tried to overcome by setting forth his case to the pillars. And they said, well, okay, you go your way, we'll go ours. But it sure would be handy if you were to take a collection among your admittedly bigger clientele out there and pay tribute to us. I mean, you owe it to us, as it says in Romans 14, I think. And I said, all right, no problem. And but then, as we also hear in Galatians, they stabbed him in the back and sent emissaries after he had left, founding a church, and said, you've made a good beginning, but Paul didn't tell you the whole thing, which is this: you better get circumcised. And said, okay. Mm-hmm. And Paul said, what? And he writes Galatians and so on. That sure sounds to me like he made a deal to live and let live, and that they repudiated it. And let's see, and that, as F.C. Bauer and others pointed out, we have the story of the final split disguised a bit in Acts chapter 8, I think it is, with Simon Magus, when he sees Peter imparting the Holy Spirit through the laying on of hands with some visible result, which, comparing with the rest of Acts, probably means they were speaking in tongues and prophesying. And Simon, depicted as a conjurer, says to Peter, gee, this is pretty impressive. I'd like to learn how you do this trick. I'll be happy to pay you for the knowledge as a colleague. And he says, what? Get the hell out of here. You have no role in this ministry. In fact, I can see you frying on a spit in hell right now. No, please pray that this may not happen. Well, okay, what I think this all meant is that at some point, as Simon's movement was growing and he was successful in founding these congregations, the Qumran elders, the 12 and the 3, thought, we're shriveling up here. We're just like in Galatians and Acts, they're the poor. Their socialistic, communalistic lifestyle bankrupted them, as it inevitably must. And so they needed cash from outside, and that's what they were relying on Paul to do. And he did, or Simon. And but then they decided that, if we could get a hold of his congregations and get them to switch their allegiance to us because we're teaching the real way of Jesus, we wouldn't have to worry about this guy. We could just get the money ourselves. They would be our franchises. And that's so that the deal was off. But while it was on, I know this is impossibly complicated. While it was on, Simon must have made a theological compromise with them. Irenaeus tells us that Simon claimed that he had seemingly suffered on the cross as the Son, and that he had been known among the Jews before that as the Father, and now he was active as the Spirit. So he was a reincarnation somehow of the Son, or perhaps it was an adoptionistic thing, and the Spirit of the Son entered into him. So he must have said, you have to the heads of the Jerusalem/Qumran church, you need to accept my Christ, my own previous incarnation. And so they began to write stories in which they still figured as the 12, but they're all shoved to the side because now it's Simon's Christ figure that is paramount in the stories. And similarly, the 3 in Qumran, well, they were the 3 pillars. And so they have very little role, but at least they're on the scene. That's something that I think Martin Noth, the Old Testament critic, called the redundancy principle, that when a new character is was made the star and put on center stage, the people who were the star are not cut out. They still have their fans, but they take a secondary role, just like Moses and Aaron. Once Aaron is introduced into those stories, Moses is just holding his coat and things like that. So that would explain how some of this stuff settled out as it did. And Simon was of a more esoteric bent, like Qumran was. I mean, they had people memorizing the names of the angels, which is, I think, obviously a Gnostic thing, because you're going to ascend through the heavens and you need to have the names of the archons as the passwords. So they seem to be they had this inheritance from Simon that it was too late to get rid of, but they didn't want to acknowledge their debt to him. So Simon gets divided into Simon and Paul. And that way you could rehabilitate what you did owe to this character. He had founded the churches and all that, but you're sanitizing him, making him one of us, as in Acts, where he's paying for these guys' sacrifices. And so that everybody will know these rumors about you are not true, that you don't tell people you don't have to keep the Torah, right? It's just obviously seems like a face-saving maneuver. So and then there must have been other feed-ins too. I think Burton Mack was right that Christianity had several roots. It wasn't just one thing that mutated. There must have been mystery religions and other types of pre-Christian Gnosticism. But my guess is that's where the basis of Christianity comes from. And one last thing, this or some version of it has to be true to explain the gaping anomaly that, oh, big deal, Jesus chooses the 12 and they go out into the world and preach the gospel. Where did Paul come from? Where this out of left field, out of nowhere? Why wasn't he one of the 12? Some people think he was, people that don't know their Bible that well. And then why did Jesus have to recruit the guy? Well, Marcion had it figured out. He said, well, look how they're depicted in the Gospels. They're idiots. Jesus must have said, oh boy, back to the drawing board. And let me find somebody who's got half a brain. Something like that must be true to fit the pieces in. Somebody will no doubt come up with a better way of doing it, but to me, that's what makes the most sense.
Right on.
That's wonderful, wonderfully said. I had another one to say as well, and I find this interesting before I asked this question. There were some ancient Gnostics out there that believed Jesus was a myth, and it didn't matter if he existed or not, as it was more the figure that you achieved for yourself. I'd like to see your views of Jesus being a myth and what evidence you would suggest for others to look towards.
That's good.
Well, the degree to which the Jesus stories parallel the Old Testament stories, and I go into that in detail in my book, The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems, where I give you the whole text of the gospel passage and the whole text of the Old Testament passage with some commentary, most of which is not original to me. In fact, I went through a whole bunch of books where scholars would point out this or that as a likely candidate for a rewritten Old Testament story. Some of their arguments I found implausible, but ultimately I found it seemed like there was not one story that didn't look kind of like it was a rewrite. Thomas L. Brody wrote some great books on this, and there were several others that I discuss in that book. So that alone might do it, but in the Christ myth and its problems, I have an essay called Jesus at the Vanishing Point, where I try to give the whole case. But there's the parallels, I suppose, are the most convincing evidence, parallels to the Old Testament, parallels to the dying and rising gods of the mystery religions. It can't all be coincidence, and nobody pretends that it is in the case. Like, why does Attis kind of resemble Mithras or Adonis?
Yeah.
Well, people don't have any problem saying, well, one must have borrowed from the other, but here, oh no, it's hermetically sealed off, and it's just too much for coincidence.
So
Of course, this makes me appreciate it all the more.
yes.
I used to still go to church. I'm kind of tired of it, but whenever it was Communion Sunday, I would think of how this all goes back to the sacred meals of Osiris, whose body was the grain and whose blood was the fruit of the vine and all that. And to
Speaking my
me,
language.
it enhanced and enriched the whole thing, that there's this archaic chain going way back there. And to me, it just made it all the more important.
Right. Yeah. Before Nathan asks this next question, I read a lot of, like I told you about the Sumerians, and a lot of people like to say that Jesus is parallel to Enki or Enlil, or sometimes even Thoth, because some people, some individuals have shared in their books that Thoth and Jesus may be the same, and Jesus and Buddha may be the same. And it's not too, to me, just personally, it's not too hard for individuals who have a mindset where they really want people to do good and just be good, be deified as a god. I don't see that too far-fetched of happening.
Oh, right. And that's what most critical New Testament scholars think. And it's not unbelievable, but the problem I have with that is, again, it's too much like ancient Euhemerism, where they figured there must have been a historical Hercules. It's too much of a big deal. And so when did he live? And poor Herodotus was trying to say, well, here he's associated with this king, but in this story, he's associated with that one, and they weren't contemporaries.
It looked like it just goes everywhere. The
somewhere.
Arrows are everywhere.
But they figured he must have existed. He was just a strong man, and I guess they probably figured Apollo must have owned a tanning salon or something. And Ares, he must have been like a Storm and Norman Schwarzkopf. It's not absurd. It's a kind of version of ancestor veneration. But the thing is it necessary? Do you really? I mean, like in all the Hammer vampire movies, they say usually there's a good reason for all these ancient superstitions, and no, there's not. But that's it's sort of common sense, but it isn't really definitive. And there's with the Jesus. Especially, I find this rings hollow, because Bart Ehrman and many others will say, well, Jesus wasn't mentioned by real historians of his day. How come, if he did all this great stuff? Well, because he didn't do all this great stuff. He was just one more rabbi, and you're not going to find a chapter on Oral Roberts in an American history book. There are a dime a dozen. But the thing is, if Jesus were that unremarkable, the question is not why historians ignored him, but why Christians didn't ignore him. It's like, again, let's say somebody's trying to prove that Superman existed, and they say, wait a minute, do you really believe this guy could leap tall buildings in a single bound and didn't need to breathe air in outer space and all that? Oh, well, that admittedly, they puffed it up for fiction's sake, but there must have really been a Superman. And so you start systematically omitting the stuff, shaving off the obvious legend. What have you got left? What was the historical Superman? Well, he was Clark Kent, a mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper. What? Would there have been Action Comics if it were only about a reporter? It's like it's self-defeating. Like, what's the big deal? It must have been a pretty big deal.
Right, right.
And for the same reason, I doubt seriously the Buddha ever existed. There's even pretty good arguments now that Muhammad never existed. I'm surprised at that one, but I've been reading more recent scholarship, and it's no surprise. Yeah, they could have puffed up a real leader, like someday they may deify Dr. King.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised, or Einstein or something.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you don't need that. I mean, it might happen, but there are plenty of examples of fictional characters that people have wound up. People still write letters to Sherlock Holmes. Will you take my case? People still write to Uncle and ask, how could I be a recruit there? And it just seems so real to them.
Right. Right. All
That's
right,
a
go ahead,
great
Nathan.
point,
I'm
because we have a
sorry.
Jedi religion too, so that's a
Yes,
terrific
that's
point,
right.
Mr. Robert Price.
Mm.
Wonderful. I also have another question. I have two more left. I want to see your view on ancient Christian rituals involving psychedelics or psychedelics
That's a good one.
within ancient Christianity.
I wouldn't be surprised, but as far as I know, there's no real evidence of it. In fact, when people have more of a case to make about Moses and the pillar of fire and all of that stuff, but their arguments all smack of 18th century Protestant rationalism. And by that, I mean the more critical thinking theologians were heavily under the spell of Newtonian physics and saw the universe as a great mechanism. To think that there were miracles that violated natural law was an insult to God. What, he had to stop things and make mid-course corrections? No, it's the incredible efficiency of the mechanism of nature that is a proof of God. But these guys still believe that the Bible was infallibly accurate. There was sort of it's like a transitional stage in theological evolution. So they wound up saying, well, okay, now we don't believe in miracles, supernatural violations. So the idea of the Bible writers being inspired by the Holy Spirit to write what they wouldn't have otherwise, okay, that's on the trash heap now. That we have to recognize that's just superstition. But maybe it's true anyway, because all the biblical writers were eyewitnesses of what they wrote. Yeah, that's the ticket. And so you have people saying, okay, Jesus didn't walk on the water, he was water skiing, or he was no, just kidding, where he knew where the stepping stones were, or whatever. He didn't really multiply the loaves and fish, but he had the Keebler elves in a cave behind him who were baking it, and he was handing it out. And with the Old Testament, they said, well, did they cross the Red Sea? Well, technically, it's the Sea of Reeds, which is true. It's a marsh. And so maybe what happened was that there was seismic activity and subterranean gases pushed up the crust of the earth in the seabed, creating a temporary land bridge, and the Israelites managed to cross over. But by the time Yul Brynner and his soldiers were hot on their heels, the gases began to dispel, the thing sank, and they all drowned. That could have happened. It's not impossible, but after and the swoon theory, right? Well, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, because of course that would be a miracle, and they don't happen. It's beneath God's dignity to pull off a magician's trick like that. So what happened? Well, the Bible's true, and it says Jesus was crucified, and it says 3 days later he appeared alive. Well, obviously he didn't die. Right. They thought he died, but he didn't. This is often taken to be an attempt to debunk Christianity. Well, it's used that way, I guess, but that wasn't the original idea. They're trying to defend the accuracy of the Bible by denying a miraculous resurrection. Well, to me, this stuff where, oh, they saw the pillar of fire, but that was because there was some sort of rust, some sort of, I can't think of the actual name, on the manna, the wheat they found in the desert, and they started hallucinating. Come on, it's conceivable. But now, again, it's not impossible because they did find some residue of marijuana in ancient temples. So I don't know, but the specific arguments for this and that alleged miracle strike me as the kind of thing where Jesus was water skiing. It just seems like contrived rationalization. And if you could find more in the way of the, finding the residue of the drug in temple vessels, okay, now that's evidence, not of much yet, but that's the kind of thing we need to know if this is plausible or not. Well, I guess I could sum this up by saying there's no real reason to believe that the supposed visions in Old or New Testament actually happened even as visions. Now, I know people have visions or hallucinations or whatever you want to call them, but these seem a little too planned and literary. Like when Ezekiel sees the weird throne chariot with God and all that, it suddenly dawned on me as I was writing my book, Holy Fable, the Old Testament without what the heck was it, without faith or something. What that is, in all of its meticulous detail, is Ezekiel's blueprint for a new Ark of the Covenant to go into the new temple. Wow. He wearisomely outlines some chapters later. I thought, surely that's it. If he had seen a vision, he'd never remember such detail. Would he have gotten into stuff like how the wheels pivot and all that? What? Well, he's making a new style Ark of the Covenant, so you don't have it fall into a ditch because the guy's carrying it with poles, trip, like in whatever it is, 2 Samuel. And so it seems to me that's kind of what we're dealing with these visions. They're like the book of Revelation. That's not any vision anybody ever had. It's all a literary construction, and a brilliant one. And it's almost doing it a disservice to think it's an actual record of visions. People have visions, but this doesn't read like one to me.
Okay.
That's a great point. Great point. And for my last question, I'd like to see your view on Zoroastrianism's influence on Christianity.
Yeah, I am of the school of thought that during the exile, Jewish priests and thinkers who couldn't help be educated about Zoroastrianism once Cyrus the Persian took over, who was very friendly to them, had high up Jewish officials like Ezra and Nehemiah. And his policy, that of the Persian Empire, was to support the reconsolidation of the religion of the people conquered by the Babylonians, their predecessors. And so they sent Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel. We want you to do your thing, and we will bankroll the reconstruction of your temple. Well, there were, as you see in Ezra, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, these guys that came with Persian authority didn't get along well with the majority of Jews who had never left Palestine. We somehow have this crazy idea that they depopulated, that the Babylonians took all the Jews away, and it doesn't say that. It's just the hierarchy they deported. Well, most Jews were still there. They used to worship at the ruins of the temple. That's what Lamentations is. It's the dirges they would sing there. And so when they got back, there was a big tension. And why? Well, I think the theory is correct that Ezra and Nehemiah and the gang basically imposed a kind of Zoroastrian version of Judaism, which is why before the exile, you have Satan as God's lieutenant, but afterward, he's the evil anti-God like Ahriman. This is why, whereas you had sacred kings earlier, now you had a coming Messiah who would raise people from the dead, like the Saoshyans, the virgin-born benefactor who would come from the seed of Zoroaster. This is why you had this apocalyptic dispensational sequence of history. Didn't have it before the exile, but they did afterward. The resurrection of the dead. You didn't have that before, you did now. Angelology, the fantastic hierarchy of angels, the idea of guardian angels that pops up twice in the New Testament, that's all Zoroastrian. And in fact, there were some rabbis who thought that Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah, was the prophet Zoroaster. What is going on here? Well, it seems to me that, this to me is the capper. Why did the Sadducees and the Pharisees not get along? Well, the Sadducees were old-time, rock-ribbed Jewish conservatives. They accepted only the Pentateuch as scripture. The other stuff, nah, it's kind of apocryphal. They didn't believe in the oral tradition of the rabbis, et cetera, et cetera. And what about the Pharisees? They believed in all these doctrines that the Zoroastrians believed, and that's why they got the name Pharisee. It was a mocking name, another pronunciation of Parsi or Persian Zoroastrian. The Sadducees were saying, "You're not even Jews anymore. You guys are Zoroastrians. Admit it." And they, oh, no, we can show you where resurrection comes from. The burning bush narrative. God said, I am the God of Abe, Ike, and Jake. Not I was. So they're still alive or something. I mean, if you got to go to that length to say your doctrines are genuinely biblical, you're grabbing at straws. So I think, yes, if this had not happened, you would not have Christianity or Islam, because it's the resurrection, the apocalyptic thing, the savior and all that. You wouldn't have had that but for Zoroastrianism, which means it is the great link between the religions of the West and the East, because it is a mutation of Hinduism, just like Buddhism is. And I have a book coming out, a massive one, over 600 pages, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Called Houses of the Holy, a higher critical survey of the world religions. It's coming out from Pitchstone Books, I guess it is, probably in 2024. But I go into all of these things, the survey of the theology of 12 religions, not the usual 5. And there's all kinds of fascinating stuff. And you probably get a big kick out of it.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you asked those questions, Nathan, because those were pretty much what I wanted to know too. Just not from him, just curiosity, period. And you answered them greatly, Dr. Price. I really do appreciate that. I like to keep these things at like to an hour, so that way we don't get overwhelmed and stuff like that. I'm wondering, would you be willing to have a second discussion with us about this? Because I'm going back.
Sure.
I'm going to watch this again. I'm going to watch this a lot. And this is